ensure that when transactions are involuntary, when you don't know whether advertising is accurate, when you don't know what you're buying, a label is required. Truth in advertising, lawsuits can be filed, and so on. The system works better than any other we have seen.
Yes, sir. What is your question?
My name is Richard Andrews, and this is principally for Mr. Hitchens. It seems remarkable to me that the changes taking place in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union are fascinating for people on the left and the right. The people on the right seem to think that this represents a move toward capitalism, away from socialism, and the people on the left, many of them, feel that this is in fact a movement toward socialism and away from dictatorial socialism. Most socialists I know never regarded the Stalinist model as socialist democratic socialism, and there seems to be a confusion between democracy and capitalism. In fact, Mr. D'Souza seems to still be confused about that. And Mr. Hitchens, how do you see the changes in Eastern Europe? Do you in fact see that they're moving toward elections and more, a wider-based decision-making power on economic decisions and so on?
Well, I mean, by way of preface to that, I mean, if you read Lenin's book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, which is a good book, what he simply says about capitalism is what I asked D'Souza to consider and you all to consider. Why is it, if it's such a brilliant system, that it has in so few countries been able to establish itself? And the criticism he made of it in Russia, pre-revolutionary, was that it simply hadn't been able outside Petersburg and a few other places to do so. And where it had done so in a way that was purely parasitic upon foreign capital, usually English and French, but to some extent German. And was content with that and with having a reserve pool of feudalism from which to draw labor. It hadn't done any of the transforming things it had done in Britain and elsewhere. And anyway, the reason I mention that is because it was part of what led to the revolution. Because the forces it did create were the forces that became the Bolshevik Party, the modernist forces. The irony of history, I think, is this, that in order for them to postpone the idea, but to keep the idea of socialism as the future and as the goal, they had to do for Russia what capitalism could not. That's to say, primitive forced accumulation, the squeezing of capital out of labor by force. Same way, the only way actually you can, or has so far been found, of inventing that in an undeveloped society. So that now, having created the material basis, as it thought, for socialism, it may have created the material basis for capitalism. But that would be not just an ironic or sardonic tribute to the principles of Marx and Engels in the manifesto, because a certain material flaw is necessary. If the Soviet Union now decides to vote in capitalism as a system, it will have the honor of being the first society ever to do so. No other capitalist society ever had the choice, or gave itself a choice, or held an election to decide that was how it was going to live. It might be wonderful if that was how the Russians decided to do it, but I doubt it. Nonetheless, the material basis for a developed society has been created. There is mass education and literacy. There's a certain amount of heavy industry. If you wanted a stock exchange, you could probably have one. The raw material for it is there, so forth.
Could the Prime answer?
Yeah, sure, by all means. But I mean, these are what I mean, at any rate, by the argument, the tussle over the materialist conception of history. Now, for the moment, I mean, this is prefaced to your question, which I've only got a short answer to. I don't believe there's an identity between free enterprise and democracy. No, I don't. It is not the same casting your vote in the ballot box or in the marketplace and exercising your consumer rights, between products, as Friedman says. Nor is it true that, as Ayn Rand says, that what you need is less democracy and more capitalism. I mean, many of the partisans of capitalism have utter contempt for democracy, and indeed feel that it couldn't coexist with it for long because it can't coexist with class rule, which seems to be indissoluble from the capitalist system. So no, but I can see how someone who's been living in Poland for the last 40 years could get away with the idea that some such identity was possible. And it'll be very interesting to watch them encounter the collision between this ideal and reality for themselves.
Just two brief comments. One is that You asked the question why, if capitalism was so good, so few countries have discovered that fact. I submit that that's not all that anomalous if one looks at other developments in the history of mankind. I expect you would agree that democracy is a good idea, and yet, certainly for most of human history, democracy has been an idea undiscovered. And until fairly recently, I think it's fair to say that democracy was concentrated in a very small part of the world, and the rest of the world was littered with all kinds of dictatorships and despotisms. So it's no argument against democracy to argue that it started small. I think it's fair to say that capitalism, although perhaps it's started relatively recently, is picking up steam in the version that I've defended and described earlier. As for the relationship between capitalism and free enterprise, I think it's a complex one. I think it's fair to say that capitalism is an important precondition for democracy to flourish. That it is very difficult for democracy to flourish without capitalism. Now, we all know that there are capitalist states that aren't democratic. So capitalism is a necessary, but I submit not a sufficient condition